Welcome, everybody. My name is Noah Bickart. I am a professor of Jewish studies in the Theology and Religious Studies department, and the Mandel Chair in Jewish Studies, even though this doesn't have much to do with Jewish studies, but kind of does because Luke is a good friend of mine, and my roommate from what seems like a million years ago at the Pardes Institute of Jewish Studies in Jerusalem. So I want to introduce everyone to Dr. Luke Whitmore, who is, hi Zeki, who is a professor of religious studies in the Department of Philosophy and Religious Studies at the University of Wisconsin at Stevens Point, who is going to talk to us today about what can the study of religion and ecology offer the world.
Thanks for inviting me. I'm excited to talk to you today. The question that I asked here is something that I've basically been thinking about for about 12, 13 years and been slowly incubating my own personal response to, and so I'm going to try to share that with you today. Before I dive in, I do want to make sure to note that I work on lands that belong to indigenous folks, such as Ho-Chunk, Menominee, Potawatomi, and that's sort of part of what it means to study religion and ecology, I think, in today's world, is to kind of understand those histories, and so it's important to name that. So the way that we're thinking we were going to kind of do this is I've got some remarks I'll offer you that will take definitely less than half the time we have, and then I'm hoping we'll have a lot of conversation. And I'm going to actually start with my conclusion. I'm going to tell you my sort of overall answer to the question I'm posing, and then I'm going to kind of take you back through a bunch of things here. So the overall answer to the question, what can the study of religion and ecology offer the world, in my view, is this. It helps us to understand the different ways that humans and non-humans connect with the broader web of life, and offers some clues about how such understandings could translate to action under the right conditions. And I'll unpack that. I teach at my university a course that I developed, a religion and ecology course, and one of the things that I tell my students is that a lot of times what studying religion and ecology ultimately boils down to is a lot of different ways to understand connections. So I feel like you can go really far into different aspects of human ecology and environmental studies, can go really far into different aspects of studying religion, and kind of come all the way back to this deceptively simple, but I think also profound idea that what we're eventually understanding are connections, or maybe interconnections. But I kind of want to back up for a second. When I was a graduate student, I didn't study ecology. My training is mostly about studying Hinduism. And when I was a graduate student and when I was doing my research that kind of qualified me to become a professor, it was all about this one Hindu sacred place up in the Himalayan mountains called Kedarnath. And this place is sacred because there's a god, Shiva, major Hindu deity, who kind of lives in that place and is kind of almost like part of the mountains in a way. People journey to this place as part of like a set of pilgrimages. And a lot of these pilgrimages are set in the Himalayan mountains, and they are kind of close to or have some kind of important relationship to the source of a bunch of important rivers that come out of the Himalayan glaciers. And a lot of those rivers eventually turn into two really famous rivers in India, the Yamuna and the Ganges, or the Ganga. And so I basically spent about a year and a half of my life living in the area, and just to kind of help locate it on a map, it's kind of up there in what we would call the central Indian Himalaya. And the big goal of my time and research that I did was I really was trying to just understand, what is it like to be in this place? What is the experience of being in this place like? And I tried to understand that in as many different ways as I could. Thinking about it in terms of the prayers and rituals, what people would do, thinking about it in terms of people who would be there because working at this place was the best job that they could get, the history of the area, this kind of philosophical ideas about the God who was understood to kind of live in this area. That was my deal. And it's located in this really amazing place. Like this is those are the Himalayan glaciers behind. The valley floor here, just the floor is like at almost 12,000 feet. I lived here for about 6 months, and then farther down in the same area for over a year. And there's a river source. It's a little bit hard to see, but there's a river that kind of comes out of the glaciers and kind of comes down like that. And so actually, just back here is a lake that is fed by melt from the glaciers. And in 2013, which is, I had just become a professor, and I was starting to take my research as a student and write it up and turn it into a book, which is like an initiation ritual that a lot of professors go through. A really awful thing happened. There was a period of super intense rain, unscheduled super intense rain. A lot of parts of South Asia have scheduled periods of intense rain. There's a monsoon season. This rain kind of like preceded the monsoon season, and it basically rained extremely hard for several days. And it rained so hard that there was this kind of, you can't see it, the glacial fed lake that was here got so full that it burst its boundaries. This whole side of the lake was not really solid rock. It was kind of more like, it's called moraine. It's kind of like a combination of like pebbles and rocks and mud. And basically the weight of the water was too strong. And so this burst, and a kind of a small wave of mud and debris came down onto this place that I had lived. Well over 1,000 people lost their lives. It was part of a whole pattern of things that happened in the region. There's a lot of grisly graphics that you can find for kind of how it all worked. It created surges on this river that went hundreds of miles downstream, and it was a pretty destructive and traumatic event. This is a kind of before after from 2013 of the site. And so both kind of personally and professionally, I had to sort of process a lot of stuff. I had to kind of grieve for the loss of some people I knew. I had to kind of reflect on how people were going to rebuild, the kind of level of sort of economic sort of destruction that had happened, because this whole area is super dependent on people wanting to come visit these places. So if people think they're dangerous, then no one's going to come. So there was a lot of economic problems. And as I started to process it, I kind of started to think through it as a scholar as well. And I really turned to a lot of stuff in environmental studies, environmental philosophy, environmental anthropology, just to kind of make sense of what I was seeing. And I was seeing a lot of different things. Some people wanted to lay the blame for this on the gods. Some people thought, well, we were starting to treat this place too much like a picnic place. And somehow this destruction is the result of kind of gods basically kind of feeling they weren't being respected. Other people were basically like, no, this has nothing to do with religion. This has to do with people who were kind of greedy and looking for, not looking to kind of build things and make, in a kind of a good, safe, long-term way. We're just kind of not paying attention to building regulations. The government wasn't enforcing them. This is really much more a story about human short-sightedness and people not kind of doing good long-range planning. And so as a scholar of religion, I was just trying to understand how it kind of all fit together, why people thought it happened, the effects of it on people's lives. And that's what really led me into thinking seriously about the interrelationships of ecology and religion, because so much of this kind of had to do with what we might call human nature relationships, how humans manage human nature relationships. And that's what really got me thinking about ecology and environmental studies and how it intersects with the study of religion. And since 2013, capitalism is pretty strong. The response wasn't to say maybe this isn't a place that people should go anymore. The response was to say, well, what can we do to still have lots of people come here and spend their money in the region, and to kind of make it safer. So all kinds of elaborate things have been constructed. Basically, for example, these whole like multi-tiered wall systems, so that the next time that there is such a flood, that it'll be better. One thing I should note is that the type of flood that kind of partially destroyed this site is referred to as a glacial lake outburst flood, a GLOF. And those are one of many types of weather patterns that are becoming more and more common in the 20th and 21st century because of different aspects of climate change. So it's one of the markers of climate change is that such events are happening more often. And I have kind of watched, sort of with fascination, this is a drone shot from 2024, that the site is totally rebuilt. More people are going here than ever. Millions of people are going to this place every year. The mountains are still there. The glaciers are still melting. The potential of such events is still there, but somehow it's kind of all been rebuilt. And I'm sort of watching that from afar, sort of a little bit nervously, to be honest. When I started thinking seriously about the sort of ecological aspects of religions and how could some of the tools in environmental studies be applied to the study of religion, I found a number of surprising things. One thing, and I don't know who here has ever taken a course on Hinduism, one of the main things I tend to teach about is Hinduism. And I always find Hinduism really complicated to teach about, and I always I have a hard time picking materials that organize things in a good way. I noticed that materials that were trying to teach about Hinduism in an ecological way were also like just a better way to teach about Hinduism. They're more comprehensible to students. They organize the material in a different way. That was sort of interesting to me. But I started noticing some things that really surprised me. So one was, I said, well, I'm very familiar in religious studies about how we really can't agree on exactly what the study of religion is. Dr. Bickar and I were just talking about that a little while ago. I found the same thing for ecology, that there's a lot of different ways of thinking about ecology. Some of them have to do more with kind of like biological sciences. Some of them are more kind of sort of human ecology. Some of them are about kind of like energy flows. There's a lot of sort of different ways of construing the field of ecology. I thought, okay, I know that game. Another thing is that they're both extremely multidisciplinary. There's no, you don't do ecology just as an environmental psychologist or just as a biologist. There's a lot of different disciplinary perspectives that you bring to bear on ecology. Same for religious studies. As anybody who's taken a religious studies course knows, you can come at it through history, you can come at it through philosophy, you can come at it through sociology. So these are both ways of studying and analyzing that draw on a lot of different disciplines. And essentially, to study either of these things, you can basically use the entire university. So then when you put them together, it's like double. That was interesting to me. Also interesting to me was, like many parts of our university, the things that we do, is that the fields in the way that they currently exist today are kind of young and kind of based on ideas that come after, come as part of and after the European Enlightenment. And I'll show you a specific example of that in just a minute for ecology. And then this one I highlighted because it's important. I realized that both of them analyze data that provoke reflection about connections between and across different forms of life, and how humans act or ought to act based on those connections. That was sort of, you could kind of find those conversations both in some parts of religious studies and in some parts of ecology. And that was very interesting to me. just as sort of a random sidebar that allows me to show a cool picture, is that the person who a lot of people would say created the discipline of ecology, Ernst Haeckel, he sort of thought in creating ecology, he was doing something that was kind of religious / spiritual. He basically had really kind of taken Darwin's ideas to heart. That made him feel like he couldn't be the type of Christian that he had grown up being, but he was interested in kind of some new religious / spiritual movements that were going on in the Germany of his time, some of which were referred to by the term monism, which is kind of means like onenessism. And he kind of thought that ecology was going to be this new way of understanding the connections between different types of life, almost like a kind of a new small r religion, maybe would be a good way to say that. So I thought that was I thought that was interesting. And whenever I point that out to people who are taking my ecology and religion class coming from environmental studies, they knew who Haeckel was, but they didn't know that that was the background of what he thought he was doing. So that was sort of interesting to me. As I started trying to learn about this field, I kind of realized that there were a bunch of different ways to think about intersections between ecology and religion. One really important one, which was pioneered by this two professors who work at Yale, John Grimm and Mary Evelyn Tucker, was basically trying to create a set of ideas that were shared between religion and ecology that would allow people to kind of be in conversation together from different backgrounds. And the idea that they basically came up with was an idea that there are a lot of different ways of saying that basically giving an account of how things work together, how the universe works together. Sometimes you would call that a cosmology. And then within cosmologies, basically based on like, here's an idea we have about how things work, how the world is, how the universe is, and based on that, here's how we think we should act within that system. They kind of created a model for thinking about how the cosmological basis of ethics that they were able to use to kind of get people to step in the same room and talk to each other who were maybe feeling hesitant about doing so. So for example, people scientists, for example, let's say in biological sciences who didn't identify as religious, getting them to step into the same room as people who are really interested in environmental stewardship from a kind of a religious perspective, and kind of finding a way to kind of like define the room in such a way that lots of people felt comfortable being in the same room and talking. And they actually created a really amazing website. It's like one-stop shopping for religion and ecology. It's called the Yale Forum on Religion and Ecology. It's a great place to go for really anything to do with this topic. Very, very well organized. So their way of kind of defining the conversation was to come up with a shared set of ideas. Then there's Roger Gottlieb edited this book. It's gone through a couple of editions. His way of kind of doing this was to say, well, let's just put together voices from different communities, different religious communities who seem to be care about Earth, care about environmental issues in some way or other. Let's just put all those voices together and kind of see what happens. So he didn't really try to like define it within a particular kind of frame of ideas. And there's things that I really like in both of those perspectives. There are also some perspectives that I would say are more interested in kind of talking about these issues using tools that come from particular parts of the university. Like, how can I talk about religion and ecology as a sociologist, or like as a historian, or as a psychologist? And I kept on learning new things as I was kind of probing different parts of this field. And what I kept on coming back to was everybody has different ways of thinking about connections. So the ecology and religion folks, they think about connections in terms of folks thinking about themselves as part of a shared story about why the universe is the way it is. In terms of This Sacred Earth, Roger Gottlieb, he basically thinks that people from different religious communities who are concerned with environmental issues can listen to each other and hear something similar and kind of come together around similarities that they're hearing and what they're articulating. The grounding religion folks are kind of saying, well, if we're interested in ecology and religion, we should study that in the same way we study anything. We should study the political aspects of ecology and religion. We should study the social aspects of ecology and religion, psychological aspects. And I kept on finding like just things out there in the world of knowledge that I had not known about. For example, folks in things, folks who are doing things like forestry research or environmental conservation, realizing that sacred groves. A sacred grove is basically a place where a bunch of trees and other plant life are growing that are said to be kind of off limits for religious reasons. People who are interested in biodiversity were finding that sacred groves, because they were essentially left alone, tended to preserve higher amounts of biodiversity, like relative to like the surrounding kind of bioregion. And what this also meant was that people who were in environmental science were needing to learn how to pay attention to people who were in, to people who like know the land in that area, and needing to also talk to like anthropologists or folklorists to kind of understand what they were seeing. Same thing, for example, realizing a keystone species is a form of life whose existence in a particular bioregion kind of acts as a sort of helps a lot of other things depending on it to kind of flourish within a particular kind of defined ecosystem. A lot of times in a lot of indigenous contexts, keystone species end up having a really important kind of religious or cultural role. And so there's a whole amount of kind of essentially environmental scientific wisdom that you could kind of learn from like asking in a particular local context, what are some of the really important forms of life in this area within your rituals? And then it turns out that has a whole bunch of environmental scientific knowledge that can be unpacked from that if you know what you're looking for. There are some other things, some conversations that I learned about that I hadn't known about. For example, there's a conversation which is literally 50 years old at this point, which attempts to decide whether certain religions are more or less sort of environmentally positive than other religions. I don't really think that this works as a conversation because I think all religions are so diverse, I don't really see how we can compare things at that level. But there's a very, very famous critique made of Christianity 50 years ago, saying that Christianity was sort of inherently too anthropocentric to kind of provide things that would be kind of like eco-positive. And I think a lot of people today in environmental studies feel that this has been disproved. But it's still circulating to the extent that people literally feel 50 years later that it's worth publishing a whole book about it. There are some scholars that say that there are literally new forms of religion that are kind of nature-centric that are emerging. The scholar Braun Taylor talks about this thing called dark green religion, forms that in which essentially being close to nature in some very intense way comes to be a sort of a new form of religion. I found that there were all these aspects of religion that I had never really thought about. I don't know if any of you have ever had this experience where like you go to class or you read something and you hear an idea and then that idea just goes off like a bomb in your mind, and all of a sudden there's this cascade backwards of a bunch of things that kind of now you realize look different to you. That happened to me a lot when I kind of started going into religion and ecology. So for example, what happens if we just start focusing on, within any particular religious context, what people think about animals and how people think about human-animal relationships? It just takes everything and turns it. Or, take Hebrew Bible. I mean, you turn the Hebrew Bible in a certain way, it looks like a farming manual. And I was also just blown away by the ways that people were coming from all across the university to understand this stuff. It's like we can't do this stuff just based on training in one department. We need people in primatology, neuroscience, history, psychology, philosophy, religious studies, and it kind of brings everything together. Another thing I noticed is that there is starting to be a way in which ecology and religion is making its way into law. If I had a spare 20 of years, maybe I would go learn about this. But basically, there are a couple of places where non-human entities that have some kind of natural and religious significance are starting to become regarded as legal entities. So for example, the earth is a legal signatory in the Constitution of Ecuador. Pachamama. It almost happened in India. It almost happened in India that two sacred rivers came to be regarded as sort of having a legal identity. Why is that important? If you are regarded as a legal entity, it means you can sue. So if you're regarded as a legal entity and a corporation is dumping its stuff into your waters, you can sue. You have legal standing. There are things happening that are basically kind of saying all these conversations are not just conversations that humans are having with each other. In terms of how we think about politics, in terms of how we think about law, in terms of how we think about kind of like planetary community, it's basically not just a human conversation. Some scholars start using the term cosmopolitics to kind of encapsulate that, because what it basically suggests is that politics isn't just like a human thing at this point. And one of the places where there then becomes work for particular types of scholars is kind of forcing us to say we need to kind of have this all as like one conversation. So for example, a lot of what I tend to think a lot about Asia, and especially the part of Asia where India is, so I'm kind of paying a little bit closer attention there. You have people kind of saying things like, well, we can't be having conversations about climate science and environmental science over here, and then kind of like anthropology and religion conversations about how local people worship mountains over here. Local people over here have knowledge that climate scientists actually need, and vice versa. And so what I'm kind of seeing as a scholar is kind of trying to take what maybe once upon a time were thought of as like different conversations and force them into a single conversation, which is not easy, right? It's not easy because even being trained in one of these things takes like at least a decade, right? So it's not an easy thing to do, but I'm kind of starting to see work like that. Like the point of these two articles is basically people who study society and culture saying to people who study climate science that there's reasons to pay more attention to how local folks kind of interact with mountains and rivers in a religious way, that there's types of knowledge there that climate scientists need if they, could learn from if they kind of know the right questions to ask and where to look. So in other words, what I'm seeing here is more and more connections, more and more realizing that the way that we to some extent, I think we have to do this in university because there's so much to understand. We kind of separate things out as, in sort of smaller units to kind of master and understand. But in a sense, we're also chopping up something that, in terms of life is actually not separate, right? So the more and more I kind of think about ecology and religion, what I'm more realizing is that everything ends up being connected to everything. The insights that somebody who's trained as an anthropologist might get, embedding with people in a particular area and kind of understanding why is this river sacred to you, are connected to the type of insights that somebody who is a hydrologist might get studying the river, for example. And it just goes on and on. I'll just give you one more example of this. Tara Rowe wrote a chapter in a book that I teach with, and this is the book that's based on the chapter that I read, and she's talking about the religious roots of the way that we have thought about oil. And what she basically points out is that a lot of the early ways that oil was thought of as a kind of an aspect of God's infinite ability to provide. And so it was regarded initially religiously as an infinite resource. And so obviously if you're thinking about oil as an infinite resource and oil isn't an infinite resource, there's a problem there. So but what this scholar kind of does is she shows how even some of the ways that we think about concepts of energy or different types of energy can have religious roots that kind of inform our thinking about those things. That really blew my mind. So the type of stuff that I'm doing now, I still go back and forth to the central Indian Himalaya. But now when I look at a village like this, sitting up in the Himalaya, terraced fields, most people are only able to live here because they're dependent on the religious tourism that comes through the area. I see it in a very different way than I saw it 10 or 12 years ago. I feel like the whole world is in this place. I feel like I can see like the same kind of broader patterns that are producing wildfires in Canada are acting on whether there's going to be another glacial lake outburst flood in this valley. This sort of same kind of global economic structures that I have to worry about are structures that folks in this valley have to worry about. I kind of realized, I think when 25, 30 years ago when I started going to India, I kind of had the Indian Himalayas kind of compartmentalized in my head as like a place that's not connected to where I live. And I think now it's the exact opposite. I feel like the distance is almost not there, if at all. And I feel like you could literally spend 50 years just studying what goes on in like 1 acre of this area. And you could use we basically need the entire university to do it. We would not run out of things to do. So with that, back to my initial thing, and then we can kind of start talking together. I think that studying religion and ecology helps us to understand the different ways that humans and non-humans fit into the broader web of life. And we can do that in so many ways, as using sociological tools, historical tools, tools from biological science. We can basically, any aspect of the university we can use helps us to see those connections in a different way, and then I think we can just mash them all together. And offers clues about how such understandings could translate to action under the right circumstances. And I wanted to give you a couple of examples of that. And I'm calling those examples seedlings because I don't think that they're anything more than that right now. So, one seedling. How many people here have heard the term sustainability bandied around? I am very taken by some of the writings of this Christian environmental ethicist named Willis Jenkins, who kind of says basically, what does sustainability mean? It means what you care about enough to want to sustain, to want to preserve. And he basically says, well, that is inevitably a fundamentally religious question. What is worth preserving? What is worth sustaining? I don't know that we realize that when we talk about sustainability, that we're talking about something that is actually getting at the very core of human existence. I think that could be an interesting frame. I already mentioned this one to you. I think that I very much hope if I'm ever in the same room as somebody who goes on to do environmental law and work on ways of kind of incorporating incorporating natural things like rivers or mountains as legal identities, I will be feel very privileged to do that. I think that there are forms of environmental law, environmental jurisprudence now that are starting to take this on, and I can give you references to that if you're interested. I think it's a really interesting direction. Another thing that I think we can kind of see is that we are seeing different types of political solidarities emerge around this intersection of religion and ecology. And they're very small, but I'll give you one example. In Wisconsin at UW-Madison, there's something called a LOCA initiative, and they are basically trying to like bring together environmental activists and scientists and people from faith communities who may or may not be both of those other things as well, together to kind of see what can be done. And so they have some stuff that they do with evangelical Protestant environmental groups like Creation Care, and they have some stuff they do with like local indigenous folks like Ho-Chunk or Menominee peoples, and they're getting all these folks together in the same room. I think that there are some interesting forms of political solidarity that may yet emerge if we can kind of like define the conversation in a way that people feel comfortable stepping into that space together. Another thing, and so it's cool that we have people from an environmental justice class here. I think that slowly problems of environmental justice may kind of become more and more part of our common vocabulary. I think they're differentially that now. I think for some groups, I think are very aware of environmental justice problems, others maybe not so much. One example that I would offer you from the upper Midwest was the Standing Rock protests. There was an oil pipeline that was to be built across native land, and the protests against it really went from being something involving local stakeholders to something national, almost global. It spanned years. The place where the protests were happening became a kind of a sacred ritual space. It really, I think, showed a kind of religious and political solidarity created through ritual that was a little new. So I think that I think it's possible that over time that we're going to become just more sort of publicly conversant with problems of environmental justice, and the idea that perhaps that those have religious dimensions. Another thing is that we're going to see responses to environmental problems being more and more overtly framed as religious problems. There's lots of folks in this room that are experts on this. I think the example of Pope Francis is a huge example of that. Another example in India is that there's been a very, very strong religiously inflected drive to clean up the Ganges River, which is being framed in a kind of Hindu terms. I know I didn't put it here, and I think it's unclear whether they're doing it as more of kind of window dressing or out of sort of a sincere way, but I think you can see some, when the Chinese government talks about renewable energy, you can see some kind of vocabulary that's being used that comes out of a kind of a Confucian and Taoist kind of rhetoric in a way. Those are just a couple of ways that I see the intersection of religion and ecology basically becoming more and more something that the public knows about. And so the final thing I'll say is that, for people who are kind of within the university and doing this work, I think there's some particular things that we have to offer. One, recognizing and naming common ground and forms of knowledge that might otherwise be missed. Two, by helping to break down barriers that impede communication and understanding. Three, by identifying fertile ground, forgive the pun, in other words, like the conditions under which particular strategies might be Successful. Like if we're, I'll give you an example from central Wisconsin. my university is nationally known as a Center for Environmental Studies. We care a lot about environmental problems. We also live in a part of Wisconsin that's very politically polarized. And so one of the things that we have figured out is that it doesn't make sense where we are to have big public conversations about environmental issues. So we figured out lots of small, quiet ways to have those conversations, because people who are in environmental education or sociology or psychology have kind of, figured out like what is more likely to work in this context than something else. So anyway, that is what I wanted to say to you. Like I said, I've been thinking about this stuff for about 12 or 13 years, and this is almost the first chance I've had to kind of put it all together for myself. So thanks for giving me that opportunity, and let's talk.
Thank you for that talk. That was great, and really resonated in a lot of ways with the things that I sometimes think about. So let me just give you kudos for that first. And I had sort of three little areas that I'd like to touch on that sort of resonated with me as you were talking. So the first one is this overlap of religion and ecology, and thinking about spirituality of outdoors and of sacred places. Like there are many people, and I would put myself fully in this category, who, if we want to recharge our batteries, if we want to sort of, experience a feeling of self-transcendence, we do this by going outside. We go into nature. You see a mountain, you see a forest, and you are in the middle of it. You see a valley, and you realize, how small you are. Not in a bad way, but just like in a perspectival way. Like, wow, something is so big here, and so grand, and so much older than me. So you have this feeling of self-transcendence, which could also be experienced as a religious experience. And so I think that's just there's some personal resonance here with me to what you're doing, and a kind of interconnectedness. So just that as a sort of prolegomena to the other aspects of this. So the second one is this idea of religion and law, right? Or ecology and law. And so can you name a river as a legal entity, for example, or a forest, or the sacred grove? Does it have rights, or should it have rights? And this is actually not a new thing, because as you were talking about that, I was thinking to Assyrian treaties from the 600s BCE, in which you can call upon heaven and earth to witness the treaty between two kings. So they are entities, they are living beings that are part of the legal process. Okay, so I thought that was interesting. And then, just as a sort of side note, there is a sort of politics and economy of naming nature, right, as a legal entity. If we want to protect it, then we have an interest in sort of the web of life idea, but there's potential countervailing tendency, because our capitalist systems tend to want to exploit nature. So rather than let's save the sacred grove and the species that live in it, let's cut it down because someone wants to build a house, right? And we tend to be very short-sighted in our sort of capitalist systems. And then last one, just a little shout out to post-humanism, which I'm sure this is part of this web of interconnected discourses that you have been looking at. But post-humanism and religion has been advocating that we should get beyond the anthropocentric perspective of religion, that we are thinking only about the humans, and we should be thinking more interconnectedly about something like web of life, and then you're then talking about the post-human perspective. So those are my thoughts.
Well, in reverse order, Mary Tucker and John Grimm like the concept of anthropocosmic, which is to say, like, well, there might be something special for us to do as humans, but that doesn't necessarily mean placing ourselves above or sort of apart from. Yeah, you're right that in South Asia as well, like there's a strong pre-modern habit of treating deities as legal entities, so it's just kind of a simple, kind of like extension of that in a way. And also to your point about being in nature, that's a good example of how I feel like the university can help. I have a colleague in my department named Christian Diem, and he's an environmental ethicist by training, and he wrote a book, I can give you the reference, that is basically a review of environmental psychology scholarship about how exactly going into natural settings changes how people behave. And there's a lot of nuance there that I can't draw out of my head right now. But some situations are a little bit better than others. But like that is an example of kind of like, so I was keeping. So that's an example of kind of like, well, what would environmental psychologists have to say about how we can, what are the downstream effects of kind of helping people to kind of encounter the natural world more, and what are the kind of possible downstream behavioral like effects of that? And that's exactly, I think, what universities can offer. Yeah.
Thank you very much for your presentation. That was really interesting. Let me try to frame my question well. So I really like your focus on connections. I'm wondering, how to understand what I might call, an anti-ecological movement. So we're seeing that now in our politics. There's a kind of animus, even sometimes against environmental protection and preservation. And I wonder about the religious dimension of that movement. And we're speaking in such broad terms here, religion, ecology.
Right.
But I wonder if you could comment on that movement
Yeah.
as well. So it's like you tended to focus rightly on more positive connections, let's say. You noted the possible criticism of Christianity. But I'm kind of interested in the movement now.
Yes. So within all of these different like kind of streams of scholarship on ecology and religion, I am finding myself more and more interested in ones that are very interested in context. Like I think it's one thing to say, oh, well, we can obviously find pro-environmental Christian teachings. It's another thing to say, well, how do we know exactly when those teachings are going to have a defined effect? So we know that Pope Francis has said some very pro-environmental things, but they have had a very diffuse effect, in different populations. And the reasons for that are, I think, have a lot to do with particular socioeconomic, political, contexts. So what I find myself more and more interested in are the material conditions under which certain things are possible. Like the area I study, I could talk for 2 hours about eco-positive aspects of Himalayan Hinduism. But in the area I go to, people are so dependent on money from religious tourism that those ideas don't matter very much in the short term. And so to me, I think I don't think it makes sense to kind of study the ideas without thinking about particular context in which they operate. And so I think that one utility of what for example sociologists of religion in America might be able to offer is like, well, here are the conditions under which something is possible. But I think the opposite is also true. Here are the conditions under which something isn't possible. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Like, don't wait, put your energy here. Don't waste time running against this locked door over here. Like, there's a better way to do that. So I am neither a sociologist nor an Americanist, which I just have to say as a disclaimer before I say this. Like, they're here the two that. So I feel like if at some time in the next couple of decades there were like an extremely centrist, openly Christian presidential candidate who was sincerely environmentalist as a Christian, I feel like that could be very politically powerful. I have no idea how possible that is, because like I said, see my lack of qualifications. But I kind of wonder about that, because we are aware, for example, of US-based Protestant and Catholic environmentalist groups, like these discourses are there. The one thing that I'm most convinced by was a talk that I went to, and I can provide you the reference after class, about the idea that the way to have changes happen is basically by seeding a number of really small things, and eventually there'll be some kind of critical mass, and then things will flip. And I attended a panel presentation that basically said that the best way to do that is to encourage more forms of ritual that involve engagement with nature, and that sort of just very kind of like not overtly political, but that somehow there would kind of be this like later downstream effect that would be, you could really only model using kind of like, essentially like complex systems theory or something like that. But to me, I think that's exactly where you want the team of social scientists who are in on these things to kind of be like, let's see if we can figure out what's a better use of our time. Does that make sense? Yeah.
Very briefly, thank you very much for this wonderful talk. I teach a course on Islam and the environment, and I like the way that you mentioned everything is connected to each other in the world of nature.
Mm-hmm.
We have a statement that an Islamic scholar says, the one who has created the sun is the same one who has created the eyes of a fly.
Mm-hmm.
Because the eyes of the fly is actually connected to the sun, because if the sun is too bright, the fly cannot see. So there's a connection between all elements of nature. And the concept of anthropocentric could be sometimes related to some misunderstanding of some religious texts, because it gives paramount importance to the level of human being in nature, but also from an Islamic perspective, human beings are responsible. They cannot do whatever they want. Their actions should be limited. They cannot, for example, harm an ant. They cannot harm a creature. Yes, they are higher because they are honored by God. The children of Adam are honored, but they are not in a position to do whatever they want.
Thank you. Yes, and what you're saying reminds me of some things I learned from Huda Al-Kaf, who's the head of the Wisconsin Green Muslims Association, and she also works in environmental studies. She talks a lot about the special role that humans have in maintaining the balance of creation as ordained by Allah.
Yes.
So that really reminds me of that. And it also reminds me that, like, one of the things, to get back to that concept of connections, that I'm very, very struck by is the idea that humans need to have a special role to play within God's creation. We're connected by being part of creation. The idea of interdependence that you see in like Buddhist or Hindu or Jain teachings. The idea of kinship with other forms of life that you see in many types of indigenous teachings. The idea that at the end of the day, whatever particular scale of analysis you're doing in environmental studies, that everything within a particular system ends up being connected once you can understand it. To me, that's the through line across different religious contexts, across the way they might study things in the context of politics or economics, or in the context of environmental sciences. That's the through line to me, is that realizing that it's about finding and understanding connections, and then based on the degree to which you understand those connections, what ought one to do in a particular context.
Thank you very much. I have to catch something.
Okay.
I will come. I will be back.
Yeah.
ecology is more like giving us the facts, hard facts, and religion is like the interpretation of that fact, like giving it a meaning. That be a correct way of explaining the relationship between them?
I don't know. I mean, I think there's a lot of different types of ecology that would be, it would be a little bit different depending on what thing you were looking at.
Mm-hmm. I mean, my question is, can religion misinterpret ecological facts?
Okay.
And so, do we always see a good marriage between religion and ecology? Can that actually end up being a bad marriage? Right.
Well, I'm not even sure I want to construe them as different things totally, but I think that I'm trying to channel the person in my department who's a philosopher of science and teaches environmental ethics. I don't know as I'd want to contrast those contexts as one being value-free and the other being value-laden. I think it might be more complicated than that. I have heard people talk about the relationships as being one of three. One is ecology can help religious communities to kind of better apply their religious teachings. In which case, there's a sort of like ecology is kind of serving as a kind of like a consultant, so to speak. Another model is ecology can help a religious community to realize what it already knows. So Huda Al-Kaf, the leader of Wisconsin Green Muslims, that's her position. She basically said that, and she's in environmental studies, she says environmental studies doesn't add to her understanding of Islam because the concept of balance is already there in such a fundamental way that nothing needs to be added. And then the third paradigm is that there could be something that, in sort of from the perspective of a particular type of ecology, is not a good idea, and that some religious community might have to change course. So I've seen all three of those articulated. I wouldn't want to say it's always going to be one or the other, or there aren't other options. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I'm thinking for people who are anti-environmentalists, and can we make, even when this idea of anthropocentrism, can that stay and still turn them into doing something for the environment? So does anthropocentrism have to be bad?
Right.
Because at the end of the day, you still have to care for the environment because it's going to be bad for you.
No, I don't think so.
That's still anthropocentric, but it pushes you to act for the environment.
I don't think it's necessarily bad. And one example of that, so tell me if I'm wrong here. In Jewish environmental ethics, I've read that the idea is that treating the natural world makes it is good, not because it's a good in and of itself, but because it makes it easier for you to treat other humans better. So in other words, it's sort of pro-environmental, but not at the cost of anthropocentrism, if that makes any sense.
I think we have time for one more question.
Any student
Any
questions?
students want to say?
Come on, y'all. Represent.
If no one's going to take the opportunity, then I will ask mine. Yeah. So to go along with what Samiha was saying, I am really curious if there are any religious discourses that are connecting environmentalism and ecology to mass extinction number 6, and then connecting those, so this idea that biologists say we may be entering into the beginning of another mass extinction because we're in an Anthropocene period and humans are running amok over the planet and basically using too much space. And so that it seems to me the implication of that would be that humans need to downsize themselves, but that this becomes then a fraught proposition, because if you think of Pope Francis's position in Laudato Si, he says, yes, we have an environmental problem, but the solution is not to try to downsize the human population or control our reproduction. And so there's a vested interest for every religious group to try to bigger itself.
Right.
Well, the vested interest from the interconnected web of life perspective might be for us to downsize ourselves. Is this something on the radar screen at this point?
I'm just going to say what your question makes me think of, because I got to think through it for a longer answer. But Amitav Ghosh is a anthropologist turned fiction writer. Recently wrote a lot of eco-fiction of South Asian descent, and he had a book called The Great Derangement, where he basically says that a lot of what's going on right now, it's sort of hard for us to wrap our minds around it, because essentially the cultural forms that we have, the stories that we have, didn't prepare us for it and don't allow us to recognize it. And so he doesn't specifically talk about capital R religion, but I mean I think you could in some cases you could kind of say, well, that's there are lots of religious stories that can wrap around this awfulness, but like they're not doing a very good job. And so to me, that as a scholar of religion, that's interesting to me. Why aren't they? So I'm not going to try and answer that right now. But like that to me is because I think once you start looking into any religious tradition, you can find stuff that applies to the situation. It's not a problem. So then the question becomes why, to the degree that we're not, why aren't we? And that opens up a lot.
Please join me in thanking Dr. Whitman.